So, in this module, we're going to explore what I've called embodied and enactive approaches to cognitive science. This is a rather ill-disciplined term, which picks out quite a few intellectual currents, not all of which are very recent, all of which do approach the body in a way which is somewhat at odds with most orthodox constructions that you will find represented in the manner in which the person is discussed in contemporary society and assumed to be shored up by science. The module has had several names because of the eclectic nature of the sources we're going to bring together. I used to call it topics in post-cognitive approaches. Post-cognitivist approaches was the label I used, and that picks out another called Cognitivism, which we're going to discuss today. We're starting off a little bit with a negative definition just to orient ourselves and realize what we're not going to be talking about in this module and why it might be worthwhile bringing this ragtag collection of embodied and other approaches and related approaches to bear within cognitive science in developing useful stories, developing new insights into ourselves, and perhaps getting over some of the limitations that the more orthodox construction of the person are faced with. I always try to emphasize that when we're doing cognitive science, we're dealing with the construction of the person, our view of ourselves, how we fit into both things called abstract, things called society and nature, neither of which are simply given, and that the ideas are therefore very antique and have changed an awful lot in that time. And I always try to use these landmarks in order to stabilize the discussion, because absent landmarks, historical discussions go wrong very quickly. If we're dealing with humanity as a species, the human as a kind, then we're looking back on you may choose anything from 40,000 to a million years of prehistory. So if that's our goal, to say something about a person, then it ought to apply to people who lived perhaps 10,000 years ago. But if that's not our goal, that's fine as well. We don't have to generalize or make broad sweeping abstract statements about something ill-defined called the human. For our purposes within the scientific world, 1600 stands as a useful landmark to peg more or less the birth of scientific modernity, the emergence of the mechanical worldview, and of course the landmark figure of René Descartes that we keep coming back to. Now, scientific modernity was not built overnight. The 1600s were a time of rabid witch burning in Europe and other parts of the world. Descartes' social position was very radically different from ours. But from that time on, we begin to see science as an organized domain with cosmological ambitions, and the images, terms, concepts of science change continually from then. So it's not that we end up with, we begin in 1600 with a fixed model. We don't. Similarly, we need to bear in mind that around the middle of the 19th century, and I've just put 1850 as a memorable sort of landmark, we're dealing here with profound changes in human living in what are now called developed parts of the world. We have the Industrial Revolution, we have the flight of people from the countryside to the city, complete inversion of the manner in which most people in those countries that underwent the Industrial Revolution live their lives. Most people now are faced with employers, for example, in the sense of a job in a factory. The material processes of life are changing. The interdependencies between parts of the world are changing as colonialism goes about its business and begins extracting resources from far-flung places. And of course, around this time, Darwin lands, and it's my contention that Darwin is useful for us as a figure, not because of what you learnt in school about the theory of evolution and natural selection, but because from that point on, we can no longer assume that humans are outside the natural order, that humans are blessed with some kind of soul that animals don't have. And so we have to understand ourselves within a biological register, however that develops, within an organismic register, however that develops, perhaps as a kind of animal. That's a very different distinction from organism. And those challenges are with us today. And they are only becoming more acute as we enter a time of mass species extinction, planetary change, climate change, and so on. Those challenges don't go away. The third date on the timeline there is 1945. And notice that those periods are slowly contracting there. So we've got 250 years in the first period. We've got 100 years in the second period. And now we're 80 years after that point. My diagram's probably not entirely to scale. And I've just put a big red exclamation point there. You don't need me to tell you the history of the first half of the 20th century with its cataclysmic wars, from which we emerge in 1945 with the atomic bomb. When we're discussing cognitivism, if it aspires to saying something about people, however we understand that term, we're speaking in a language and critiquing or discussing a worldview that only emerged after 1945, so very, very recently. The degree to which, however, this construction of the person has a hold on the modern imagination might make it seem that this view has always been there. It emphatically has not. Susan Hurley, the late philosopher, had a wonderful term when she described the cognitive sandwich. This is she's making fun of the notion, she's critiquing the idea that mind sits somewhere between perception as generated and constructed from sensory input, and as being then the locus from which executive action goes out. So this pipeline of perception, cognition, action, with cognition sandwiched in the middle, serves to caricature the architecture which has so captured our imaginations. And you won't find this argued for as a reasonable way to approach people, but you will find this kind of model. Once we're into computational models, information processing models, here we have a fairly standard model. This is not a scientific fact or a description of a human. It's an organization of concepts put together by someone in which we have sensory input leading in through processes of attention and pattern recognition to a short-term memory, which is somewhat fallible, some of which gets encoded into some mysterious thing called long-term memory, which can support processes of retrieval. And in common with most of these models, the second piece of bread is missing, actually. There's no action at all in this. So this sees the person as someone who sucks up information, whatever that is, from the world, processes it, and then acts. As a philosophy of mind, this is abysmal. As a way of talking about ourselves, it's very popular. And it's this basic vocabulary that we are going to be leaving in this module as we consider other approaches. Now, that cognitive system scooping up input from the outside world looks to a philosopher like a solipsistic model. How could this know anything outside of the contents of its own mind? We have a strict division between subject and object, subject now being the individual mind, all qualitative aspects of the world, everything to do with feeling, emotion, affect. And this is also the person who bears responsibility for their actions. So we've created something of a monster here. And likewise, the world is now reduced to objects, mere inanimate things devoid of agency. There's a strong dualism here between the mental and the physical. That dualism extends to the distinction between qualities, how things feel, smell, taste, look like, and the quantitative, those things you can measure using the instruments of science. And it underlies a lot of our epistemological debates when we speak of objective facts and describe everything else as mere subjectivity or merely subjective. That distinction between truth and mere opinion is one of the oldest philosophical chestnuts ever. But when we say that's just subjective, or that's subjective and that's objective, we're leaning on this improbable dualism. And don't blame this guy. This is reputedly the skull of René Descartes. It sits in the Anthropological Museum in Paris, and it's one of, I think, 7 skulls that claim to be Descartes' skull. And interestingly, it's written all over it. And peer as hard as you might, and I tried very hard peering through the glass. I couldn't find a cogito in there. Descartes bashing is something of a sport, and you'll find people doing it every day in the cognitive science literature, accusing each other of being Cartesian. Don't do that. Descartes lived in an entirely different time, with the religious wars, the witch burnings, the political, social situation in which Descartes lived is entirely unlike ours. And cognitivism is not Descartes' construction. Cognitivism is only possible to articulate after the Second World War. I like this slide that Jasper van der Herik provided to illustrate some of the theoretical schools within contemporary cognitive science. And at the top left there, you see substance dualism. This is the usual knee-jerk way of characterizing Descartes' worldview. Again, we can leave Descartes out. But you can see with the red circle there, there's a graphic distinction in this illustration, and they're just cartoons, of the distinction between mind, which is not situated in the body, and body. Moving from along the top row, we come to behaviorism, in which appeal to the mental is outlawed. Most forms of behaviorism, if they have any metaphysical stance at all, which they usually don't, would be materialist. Behaviorism is a complicated issue. It's not just an academic school from the start of the 20th century. One of the readings this week seeks to prevent us telling very simplistic stories about progress in the development of a science of psychology. But clearly there's no red things here in the behaviorism slot. The next 3, identity theory, functionalism, and eliminativism, lurk in the background of most cognitivist accounts. They differ. What they all do is understand the brain as playing an extremely important, indeed, the role. The brain is the locus of explananda when it comes to the mental. In identity theory, we have something a bit hand-waving, where we say the activity of the brain is what produces the mental. Mind is what the brain does, as Marvin Minsky famously articulated, although quite how that should be understood is left somewhat unarticulated there. 2 possible ways to do that arise in functionalism, where you say, well, if we're talking in cognitive language about problem solving, remembering, deciding, those kinds of things, that is in the brain, but we will not articulate it in a neuroscientific register, we'll articulate it in a functional register, but those functions must somehow be implemented in the brain. So we have a distinction between functions that are implemented and the material substratum. This gives rise to views that, for example, mind could be implemented in software. Eliminativism takes a slightly different tack. It also maintains this central role for the brain, but it chooses to say that those functional descriptions are equally hand-wavy. And the right vocabulary for this is actually neuroscientific. And once we get our neuroscientific facts straight, all this waffly talk about qualities and minds and so on can go away. That is an extreme position, most commonly associated with the philosophers Paul and Patricia Churchland. But you can see the functionalism and eliminativism are both grappling with ways of taking identity theory and making it somehow real. In this context, the next one down there shown is Daniel Dennett's suggestion of the intentional stance. This is not a full-fledged philosophy of mind by any means. It's the suggestion that we make sense of each other by attributing minds to each other. That is, by considering each other as if we were intentional beings. So you can see here there's an arrow and the red dot is inside someone else's head. It's a fiction, it's a theory that helps to make the other person understandable. Notice that what this still has, though, is the fact that the other is strictly other and unknowable as such. So these are only a smattering of contemporary positions and the philosophical problems they face. We'll be leaving these behind in this lecture, in this module. Next week we'll be moving to the embodied mind, and there you can see a smartphone in the person's hand and it's red, and we'll be looking at what happens if you allow those red things to be in the world as well as in the person. And you can see there's a dotted line linking the person and their smartphone. That's next week's fun. The extended mind should be kept separate from the very many varieties of embodied cognition that we'll meet. They're not necessarily incompatible. What they have in common is that this red stuff, the way we talk about the mental, the qualitative, the subjective, is no longer skin-bound, is no longer stuffed inside a single body. With embodied cognition, we'll find different ways of considering the manner in which we talk about ourselves and all the mental, without strictly localizing it inside anyone, and crucially involving both the world and others in our debate. So that's just to set us out on the trajectory. Now, I said cognitivism can only be articulated after the Second World War, the development of the computing metaphor and the rampant, undisciplined use of the language of information. But critiques of the scientific construction of the person as a strongly individualist, semi-divine intellectual being have been around the whole time as scientific psychology grew. One of the most famous critics of this is Alfred North Whitehead, who gave us the useful term, the bifurcation of nature. And nature here is a generic abstractum, which we shall presume we haven't yet got a handle on, but we're going to have to assume that we're all within something. And he says bifurcation is what happens whenever we think the world is divided into two sets of things, one of which is composed of the fundamental constituents of the universe, invisible to the eyes, known to science, yet real and valueless. This is typically the manner in which a physicalist debate is conducted. And the other, which is constituted of what the mind has to add to the basic building blocks of the world in order to make sense of them. So he's pointing at a strong mind-body dualism, a deanimated, inarticulate, non-agentive world, and a mysterious mind. For Whitehead, the bifurcation of nature forms a formidable impasse in how we approach fundamental philosophical questions, such as the nature of mind, experience, value, and in particular, and this is really interesting because Whitehead is leveling his critique here early, it's in the 1920s or 30s, and he says, in particular, the ontological nature of the organism, which for him would become the central concept in his metaphysics. So Whitehead is attempting to rise to the challenge of Darwin, and he is not elaborating his ideas in a mechanical mode at all, or even in a strongly physicalist register. He's a very useful reference point, even though his philosophy is rather difficult. And just to riff a little bit on the distinction between the manner in which we think about the world and the subject, I like to contrast these two pictures. On the right-hand side, is that the right? It is the right-hand side. You see the mental model we have of spatial reality, something we have acquired since the development of linear perspective and the development of technologies that rest on the optical representation of a world from a static monocular point of view. That sounds rather technological, but that gives rise to, first of all, the photograph, and then the moving picture, and then a cinematic imagination that we seem to be unable to get rid of. And we forget that this is, in fact, a model, and it is not a transparent window into the nature of time and space. Time and space in this view are containers. That is part and parcel of the mechanical worldview that came into being with scientific modernity, and it has captured our imaginations beyond belief, actually. Compare that, if you will, with the position of the subject on the left-hand side of the screen. This is a still film taken from a surrealist film, Le Chien Andalou, or was it L'Âge d'Or? One of those Buñuel Dali movies. And here, to the horror of everybody, a razor is about to be sliced across an eyeball. Now, consider the position of the subject here, and you can see her eye. To her, space is not an undifferentiated medium in which a meter here is equivalent to a meter there. Her space is organized around the body from a subjective organismic center. For her, time is not an abstractum. It is the flow in the present of events in which something rather terrible is about to happen. I produced these just to sort of kickstart your imagination and make you think that as we approach the perplexities of embodied cognitive science, of thinking of ourselves as in an organismic register, sometimes an animalistic register, or very abstractly but grounded in the body, some of the familiar ways of thinking we have about ourselves and the world might not stand up to scrutiny. So there's a bunch of readings which I prepared for you. This is just a snapshot of the web page. First of all, I wrote a little blog post on cognitivism as a term. And then you have the first two chapters of a book by Thomas Fuchs, who is a philosopher and a psychiatrist working in Heidelberg, and from his rather excellent book, The Ecology of the Brain, with the subtitle, The Phenomenology and Biology of the Embodied Mind. So his first two chapters there serve to enrich the kind of debate I've just said. They introduce some concepts which we will meet and develop later on in this module. In particular, Thomas Fuchs is one of the most obvious articulators of an enactive point of view, and it'll take us a few weeks to get there. But I find them very well written and salient. If you want to read further, the article from John Dewey, one of the three great American pragmatists, William James, Charles Sanders Peirce, and John Dewey, that's the oldest reading I assign on this course. It's from 1896. And he critiques a scaffolding notion that is emerging in the contemporary, at his time, contemporary psychology. The notion of a reflex arc. And it's quite prescient because when you read this paper, it's a bit bewildering, to be honest with you. It's written from 1896 in the context of a psychological science that to us is very foreign. And yet what he's critiquing is precisely the input-output representation of the person, leaving the person devoid of its reciprocal links with the world, of its necessary embedding in the world. It's very, very prescient. The final article there, entirely optional, is by Alan Costal, and it complicates the history of psychology, scientific psychology, which is often presented as if there were clearly recognizable stages. Anything goes at the start, then there's behaviorism, which is problematic because it reduces the person to a kind of a puppet, and then along comes cognitivism and reintroduces some of the original concerns of psychology, but it too runs into problems and is replaced by a new paradigm. Linear developments like that are very, very untrustworthy, and that article is worthwhile if you want to get a more nuanced account of things. But we're not simply doing psychology here. We are doing cognitive science, and when we move into an organismic register, things will look different. Some of these approaches are often grouped together today under the 4E label. The 4 E's stand for extended, embodied, embedded, and enacted. Some people like to tack a fifth one on there, ecological. Others like to tack O's and A's, and it's a bit like the LGBT thing. Letters keep getting added by people who feel that their concerns are not adequately represented in the flagship 4 labels. But these 4 are worth considering. Extended is the first one, and we'll be addressing that next week with the extended mind hypothesis. The extended mind hypothesis is a specific hypothesis associated with a specific paper from 1998. And it is composable. It can live in the same explanatory space as many of the other approaches we'll be looking at, but it's not the same thing as them. Embodied is the central concern. We are definitely embodied beings, and that is our rather weak but perhaps uncontroversial starting point for many of the approaches we'll be following. Embedded gets less discussion. Embeddedness has to do with the inextricability of any goings-on from the context in which those goings-on happen. This seems to be forced upon us in one sense as we drop back into the natural world and see ourselves as not entirely autonomous, not entirely distinct. Furthermore, embeddedness or sensitivity to context turns out to be absolutely essential in relativizing what it is that we find out, for example, from experimental methods in which we remove the person from their normal context and study them as if they could be studied without context. That crucial ineliminability of context will be a theme, major recurring theme throughout all the approaches we survey. Enacted points to a still somewhat amorphous school of thought known as inaction, and as I said, it's going to take us a couple of weeks to get there. The basic core sense of inaction is to bring into being by doing, and while we will be encountering many philosophical developments of that term with quite profound consequences, a simple way of thinking about this is if you want to have a parade. You can make plans for a parade, you can submit applications to the parade, you can sit at home and draw pictures of the parade, you can design your costumes, but you don't have a parade unless you get out there and you march. The only way to have a parade is to enact a parade, is to bring into being by doing. That's just a rather glib way of pointing towards the theme of inaction, which will so concern us. So with that, we're going to kick off the module. In this module, you will be confronted with primary texts that I will not be taking a stance with respect to. They don't all speak or sing from the same hymn sheet. They are seminal. They are important in that they serve to make you aware of many of the questions that we approach as we face up to Darwin's challenge and realize that we are embodied beings in the natural world. And in class, I will want you, if possible, to lead the discussion. I'll provide for each reading a short video introduction, but not a full lecture. It's not up to me to tell you what these texts mean. That's the point of this module. The point of this module is for you to encounter the text and to make your own minds up about this. In keeping with that, I might as well drop this here. The evaluation in this module will work as follows. None. The module is graded pass-fail. If you're taking this module, you pass. We will have blog posts. I will do another video suggesting how to do blog posts, providing with some information there. I do want you to engage with the module, and it's a failure if you don't engage with the module, but it's not necessarily your failure. It could also be mine. So I'll address the blog posts later. That is activity you're expected to do in this module, but you will not be examined or graded. The module is graded pass-fail. Everyone passes. It doesn't affect your GPA one way or another. Hooray for academic freedom. So I hope you enjoy the module. That's the only possible reason for having this. And I suspect that the module is rather unusual in that the concepts that you meet here may resonate with you long after the module. That's my plan. That sometimes you may not get a concept when you first meet it, but the readings have been carefully chosen to resonate and to have a long half-life. So if all goes well, you may get something from the module. Let's have fun.